If you really stop to think about it, building a human being from scratch is, well, it's a lot like trying to assemble this incredibly complex state-of-the-art ship.
Right.
But there's a massive catch here. You have to build the ship while it is already out there, actively sailing on the ocean.
Oh, man. So there's no dry dock at all.
No dry dock. The ship just has to keep floating and has to respond to the weather. And all of this is happening while, its internal engine is being constructed.
And the navigation systems are just barely coming online.
Exactly. The crew is frantically trying to figure out how to steer while the hull is being bolted together.
It is a continuous, totally uninterrupted process of construction and navigation happening at the exact same time.
It really is. And that continuous journey, from a single microscopic cell all the way to late adulthood, that is exactly what we are exploring with you today.
It's a huge topic.
Massive. So, to help you digest the sheer scale of this, we thought we'd try a slightly different dynamic for today's deep dive. We're going to do a little bit of role play.
We are. Because, honestly, having a structure really helps when you're looking at a timeline this big.
Right. So I am officially putting on the lecturer hat today. My job is to unpack the mechanics of these biological and psychological concepts, and you have agreed to play the role of the student.
I have. But, not a passive student. I've got my notebook, and my job is to be the analytical one.
The one who interrupts.
Exactly. I'll be interrupting you, poking holes in the theories,
Yeah.
and throwing those tough questions your way to make sure we extract the actual why and how behind the facts for you, the listener.
Perfect. Honestly, wouldn't expect anything less from you. So let's set the foundation. The material for today's lecture is section 9.3 of chapter 9 from Psychology 2E.
Okay, got it.
And just to keep things smooth, for the rest of our deep dive, we'll just refer to it as section 9.3 or simply the textbook.
All right, let's get into it then, Professor. If I'm looking at this chronologically, our lifespan narrative obviously has to begin before birth.
Right.
So what exactly are we looking at in those earliest stages of prenatal development?
Well, we are looking at a process defined by extreme fragility, and it happens in 3 specific stages. First up is the germinal stage, which is literally just weeks 1 and 2.
Just the first 14 days.
Yeah. And we all know it starts with a single-cell zygote undergoing mitosis to, divide and multiply. But the truly fascinating part isn't the cellular division itself. It's the sheer brutal math of survival.
What do you mean by brutal math?
Fewer than half of all zygotes actually survive beyond these first 2 weeks.
Wait, less than half?
Less than half.
That means right out of the gate, the most common outcome of conception is actually failure to implant. The biological odds are just daunting.
They are incredibly daunting. But if the mass of cells does survive and implants in the uterus, we enter stage 2, which is the embryonic stage.
And how long is that?
That spans weeks 3 through 8. And this is a massive construction phase. The placenta forms, the heart begins to beat, and crucially, the neural tube develops.
On a neural tube.
Yeah, think of it like laying down the foundational concrete and the main electrical wiring of the house before any of the actual walls go up.
Because it eventually becomes the central nervous system, right? The brain and spinal cord.
Precisely, which means any disruption to that electrical wiring early on is going to have major compounding effects later.
Right.
And then from week 9 all the way to birth, we're in the final stage, the fetal stage. This is where the fetus grows from roughly the size of a kidney bean to a fully formed baby.
That is quite the growth spurt.
It is. Around 24 weeks, hearing develops, and the internal organs mature enough that survival outside the womb is technically possible.
Okay, let me stop you right there. As the student, I have to ask, you mentioned how fragile those early weeks are.
Yeah.
If this entire prenatal process relies so heavily on a super delicate sequence of events inside the pregnant person's body, what happens when outside environmental factors crash into that system?
That's a great question. Biology gives us a specific term for that, and it's called teratogens.
Teratogen.
Yes. A teratogen is basically any environmental agent, it could be biological, chemical, or physical, that causes damage to the developing embryo or fetus.
So, like what, specifically?
The textbook highlights things like heroin, smoking, and alcohol. If, for instance, alcohol is introduced into that delicate system during sensitive developmental periods, it can cause fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD.
And how does that actually impact the development?
The mechanics are pretty devastating. It physically alters the developing neural pathways, so it leaves lifelong consequences that can range from specific facial abnormalities to severe cognitive issues.
Like what kind of cognitive issues?
Things like stunted judgment, learning disorders, and lower IQ.
Wow. Now, looking at the source material, this intersection of biology and outside factors brings up a really intense legal and psychological collision.
It definitely does.
Because Section 9.3 discusses a policy from the 1990s in South Carolina, where the state instituted a policy to arrest and prosecute pregnant people for drug use. Looking at this purely from a psychological and developmental standpoint, how did that actually play out?
Well, according to the textbook, it created a massive behavioral paradox. So the facts of the case are that the policy required mandatory drug screenings at a specific obstetrics clinic.
Okay.
The proponents of the law argued that the threat of mandatory screening and potential jail time was a necessary deterrent. Their goal was to protect the unborn child from the physiological harms of illegal drugs.
But psychologically speaking, if you threaten someone with jail time, especially a vulnerable medical patient, doesn't that just trigger an immediate avoidance response?
Exactly. And that is the exact mechanism the critics of the policy pointed to. Lawsuits eventually ended the policy after 5 years because it was actively deterring pregnant people from seeking vital prenatal care.
Because they were afraid of getting arrested.
Exactly. Out of fear of arrest, they simply avoided the clinic altogether. And on top of that, the policy was applied almost exclusively to low-income patients on Medicaid. Yeah, and later, a federal agency determined the program essentially functioned as human experimentation without the proper oversight of an institutional review board.
I mean, it's a perfect example of how you can't just isolate human development in a petri dish. Interventions have really complex, real-world behavioral ripple effects.
They really do. There are no actions in a vacuum. So let's move out of the womb and into the physical world.
Okay, birth.
Birth. When a newborn finally arrives, they are not just helpless blank slates. They actually come preloaded with survival reflexes.
Sort of like biological factory settings.
That's a perfect way to put it. Biological factory settings. For instance, if you stroke a baby's cheek, they instinctively turn and suck.
Yeah.
That's the rooting reflex designed to find food.
Right, I've seen that.
Or if you put a finger in their palm, they grab it tightly, the grasping reflex. And then there's the Moro reflex.
What's that one?
It's a startling response where they throw their arms out if they feel a sudden drop. It's an evolutionary holdover, basically designed to grab onto a caregiver if they're falling.
That makes total sense.
But beyond just reflexes, their sensory processing is incredibly acute right from the start. The textbook highlights this brilliant study by a researcher named McFarlane.
Oh, the gauze pad study.
Yes. Researchers took week-old babies, literally 7 days old, and placed them between 2 gauze pads. One pad was from the bra of a nursing stranger, and the other was from their own mother.
And let me guess, the week-old babies could already distinguish the smell.
Consistently, the vast majority turned their heads toward their own mother's scent.
At 7 days old.
Right. They are already actively mapping their world, and internally, their brains are undergoing what developmental psychologists call blooming.
Blooming.
Yeah, millions of neural pathways are growing at an explosive rate. But this blooming is quickly followed by a crucial process called pruning.
Wait, hang on. Pruning? Why would a rapidly developing brain want to cut away its own neural connections? That seems super counterintuitive.
I know it sounds weird, but it's all about efficiency. Think of the brain like a massive, overgrown manuscript.
Yep.
You brainstorm 1,000 ideas. That's the blooming.
Okay.
But if you try to publish every single thought, the book makes absolutely no sense. You have to ruthlessly edit and cut the weak sentences so the main narrative flows perfectly.
Oh, I like that analogy.
So the brain trims away unused pathways, so the active ones, the ones required to master complex motor skills and language, can fire much faster.
Okay, so the brain is becoming more efficient. But historically, psychologists like Jean Piaget argued that even with this brain development, infants has zero cognitive understanding of the physical world.
Right, the blank slate idea.
Yeah. Piaget thought a baby couldn't understand an object even existed unless they were physically touching it. Does the textbook actually support that?
No, not at all. Modern research has completely debunked that aspect of Piaget's theory. Section 9.3 breaks down a really fascinating study by a researcher named Belargin.
How did they debunk it?
Well, they took 3-month-old infants, and keep in mind, these are babies who can barely hold their own heads up, let alone interact with physical puzzles.
Right, very limited motor skills.
Exactly. And they showed them a truck rolling down a track, passing behind a screen. Then they put a solid block on the track. Using a visual trick, they made it look like the truck rolled right through the solid block.
So basically a magic trick, an impossible physical event.
Exactly. Two solid objects occupying the same space at the same time. And what they found was that those 3-month-old infants stared significantly longer at that impossible event than they did at a normal one.
Which proves they knew something was wrong.
Yes. It proves that long before they can grab a toy, infants possess an intuitive, mechanical understanding of the physics of solid objects.
Okay, so they are quietly observing and calculating the rules of physical reality.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But if they've mapped out how a truck works, how do they figure out the social world?
Right.
Because understanding physics is great, but a toy truck isn't going to regulate your nervous system when you are terrified.
Totally. Which brings us to the mechanics of attachment theory. Back in the 1950s, Harry Harlow ran a famous, and honestly, by today's standards, highly unethical experiment with infant monkeys.
Oh, the wire monkeys?
Yeah. He separated them from their mothers and provided 2 artificial surrogates. One was made of uncomfortable bare wire, but it held a bottle of milk. The other was made of soft, cuddly terry cloth, but it offered absolutely no food.
And if we look at this purely through the lens of caloric survival, the baby monkey should imprint on the wire mother, right? Because food equals life.
Right, that was the conventional wisdom at the time, but Harlow found the exact opposite. The monkeys clung desperately to the soft cloth mother for comfort. They only darted over to the wire mother when they were absolutely starving and then immediately ran back to the cloth.
Wow, why? What is the actual biological mechanism there?
It is all about nervous system regulation. A purely caloric intake keeps the body alive, sure, but it doesn't regulate the stress response. The tactile comfort of the cloth mother dropped their cortisol levels and provided a sense of safety. Comfort, it turns out, is a critical survival metric.
It's not just a nice to have.
Exactly. And this realization led Mary Ainsworth to develop the strange situation experiment to measure human attachment.
How did that work?
By having a mother leave a toddler in a room with a stranger and then return, Ainsworth could observe the reunion and categorize their attachment styles.
Okay, break those down for me. How many styles are there?
There are 4. First is secure attachment. The child uses the parent as a secure base to explore, gets upset when they leave, but is happy and easily regulated when they return.
Sounds healthy. What's next?
Second is avoidant. The child essentially ignores the parent, treating them like a stranger. They don't care if the parent leaves or returns.
Yikes.
Yeah. Third is resistant. This kid is super clingy, gets devastated when the parent leaves, but then angrily rejects the parent's attempts to comfort them upon return.
Like their trust was broken and they are actively punishing the parent.
Pretty much. And what's the fourth? The fourth was actually added later. It's disorganized attachment. This is where the child behaves erratically, sometimes even literally freezing in place.
Freezing.
Yeah, psychologically, freezing happens when the nervous system just short circuits because the child's source of comfort is also their source of fear. Sadly, this is most often seen in kids who have experienced abuse.
That is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So once a toddler establishes that secure base, or doesn't, and maps out the physical and social rules around them, the next logical puzzle they have to solve is themselves, right?
Yes.
When do they realize they are a separate, distinct entity in all this?
That is the birth of self-concept, and it is famously marked by the 18-month mirror test.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah, researchers sneakily put a red dot of paint on a toddler's nose and placed them in front of a mirror. Before 18 months, the baby usually just reaches out to touch the mirror, thinking it's another playmate.
But then something changes.
Right around 18 months, a massive cognitive leap happens. They look in the mirror, and instead of touching the glass, they reach up to touch their own nose.
They recognize the reflection as them. They exist.
Exactly.
But a sense of self isn't just knowing you have paint on your face. As that child grows, how do massive societal factors like race impact this evolving self-concept?
The textbook delves into the pioneering work of psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark to explain this.
The doll study, right?
Yes. Their famous doll study actually influenced the Supreme Court during the Brown v. Board of Education desegregation case.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they found that African-American children were more likely to choose a white doll over a black doll, highlighting how deeply societal segregation and systemic messaging harmed their self-concept.
That's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But the textbook provides a much more nuanced, modern framework for this now, doesn't it? Because while the Clark study is foundational, identity isn't just a passive absorption of societal damage anymore.
Exactly. The text introduces Margaret Beale Spencer's PVS. Yeah, it stands for the phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory.
Okay, as the student here, I'm going to need you to translate that. How does that actually work in practice?
Fair enough. It's basically a theory of meaning making. Spencer argued that children aren't just passive sponges, they actively process and assign meaning to their environments.
Meaning making.
For instance, Spencer studied African American adolescents and found something truly fascinating about how boys and girls process stress differently. For boys, experiencing higher stress actually predicted a less negative attitude toward learning.
Wait, hold on. More stress equaled a better attitude toward school. How does that mechanism work?
It's all because of how they assigned meaning to the school environment. If a boy is facing intense neighborhood or peer stress, but perceives that his teachers have high positive expectations of him, he might hyperfocus on school.
Ah, so academics become a controllable sanctuary in an uncontrollable environment.
You nailed it. PVE test shows us that identity is an active, dynamic process of navigating risk and resilience, not just a flat metric of societal feedback.
That is a massive aha moment.
Mhm.
But while society is the macro environment, the home environment has to be the primary filter for a child.
Naturally.
So how do different parenting styles shape that internal meaning making?
Well, the textbook outlines Diana Baumrein's 4 parenting styles. Let's use our ship analogy again to make sense of them.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of the permissive parent as a cruise director. Their main goal is to make sure everyone is having a good time, they make very few demands, and they act way more like a buddy than a parent.
Just endless buffets and pool games.
Right. Then you have the uninvolved parent. They aren't even on the ship. They provide basic physical needs, but are completely emotionally indifferent.
Ooh.
Yeah. Third is the authoritarian parent. This is the dictator. They place extreme value on strict conformity and unquestioning obedience. No exceptions, no warmth.
Honestly, those three all sound like they have massive psychological blind spots.
Mhm.
There has to be a middle ground where the parent isn't a dictator, but also isn't just a buddy.
There is, and that is the 4th style, the authoritative parent. This is your ideal ship captain.
The captain?
They set the course, they have clear rules, and they expect you to follow them. But they also express warmth, listen to the child's perspective, and crucially, they are willing to explain the why behind the rules. They might even relax the rules occasionally, depending on the context.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to challenge that.
Do it.
You called it the ideal ship captain. But Section 9.3 explicitly notes that this authoritative style is a very Western ideal. Doesn't the textbook point out that authoritarian parenting, the strict obedience-focused style, actually yields excellent academic and social results for first-generation Chinese-American families?
Yes, it absolutely does. That is a great catch.
Which proves that culture heavily dictates the mechanics of which psychological approaches actually work. You can't just apply a Western parenting metric to an Eastern cultural framework and expect the exact same behavioral output.
That is a phenomenal point. Context is literally everything. Now, regardless of the parenting style, eventually the biological rules of childhood expire and we hit the turbulence of adolescence.
The teenage years,
Yeah.
where the ship is practically being rebuilt mid-voyage.
Exactly. It begins biologically with puberty. And the textbook differentiates between primary sex characteristics, which are the organs directly required for reproduction, and secondary characteristics, like the development of facial hair or breasts.
Right.
But from a psychological standpoint, the timing of puberty is what causes the most turbulence.
The timing.
Yeah. Early maturing boys often gain social status and confidence, but face significantly higher risks for substance abuse. Early maturing girls often feel incredibly self-conscious about their changing bodies and face higher risks for depression and eating disorders.
That sounds like a minefield.
And late bloomers of both sexes often struggle intensely with feeling physically inadequate or just left behind.
And identity in this stage isn't just about physical timing. The textbook brings up transgender and gender nonconforming youth in this section, right?
Yes, it does. And the psychological data there is very clear. Transgender and gender nonconforming youth who are supported in their identity by their families and environments show significantly fewer depression and anxiety symptoms compared to those who are not supported.
Again, the environment shapes the psychological outcome.
Every single time.
So let me ask you about the classic stereotype of teenage behavior. Teenagers have a notorious reputation for being impulsive and reckless. Is that just a cultural trope, or is there a biological mechanism actually driving that?
It is deeply neurological, and it makes total sense when you look at the mechanics of the brain. In the teenage brain, the frontal lobes, the area responsible for logic, long-term planning, and impulse control, are basically an active construction zone.
They aren't finished.
They are not fully wired. Meanwhile, the brain's neural reward center is fully online and highly sensitized.
Ah, so they have an accelerator that is completely floored, but the braking system isn't installed yet.
Precisely. And evolutionarily, it might actually serve a purpose.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. If teenagers were perfectly logical and risk-averse, they would never take the necessary leap to leave the safety of the nest. The brain heavily incentivizes taking risks for the rush of a social reward, completely overriding that underdeveloped logical braking system.
That explains so much about high school.
Yeah.
But if the brain's judgment centers are literally still under construction into the 20s, when does the textbook say a teenager actually becomes an adult?
That brings us to a relatively new developmental framework called emerging adulthood.
Emerging adulthood.
Yeah, which spans from roughly 18 to the mid-20s. In Western cultures, the requirements for bachelor's degrees, massive student debt, and shifts in the workforce have severely delayed financial independence. This has created what they call the boomerang generation, where kids graduate and move right back into their childhood bedrooms.
But that implies adulthood is just an economic milestone.
Yeah.
The textbook contrasts this Western delay with countries like Malawi, right?
Yes, it does. In nations like Malawi, adult responsibilities like marriage, having children, and working the fields to support a family often begin between 10 and 15 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, it perfectly highlights that the transition to adulthood is as much a societal and economic construct as it is a biological one.
So moving past that gap, wherever it lands culturally, we finally hit actual adulthood. This is the longest stretch of the lifespan. We shift from rapid explosive growth to maintenance and eventually inevitable decline.
Yes, physically it's a very long arc. Early adulthood, spanning your 20s to early 40s, is your peak physical performance. Muscle strength, sensory abilities, cardiac functioning, they are all totally maximized.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
Right. Middle adulthood, 40s to 60s, brings gradual decline. Skin loses elasticity, visual acuity drops, hair goes gray, and fertility declines.
And late adulthood.
Late adulthood, from the 60s onward, is where senses decline much more significantly, reaction times slow down, and the brain actually begins to lose some mass.
Okay, let's talk about the brain losing mass. Is cognitive decline just a steady downward slope? Do we slowly lose our capacity to process the world as we age?
Here is where the mechanics of aging get really incredible. Cognitive aging is actually split into two types of intelligence. First, you have fluid intelligence.
Fluid intelligence.
This is your raw processing speed, your working memory, your ability to reason logically on the fly. And yes, fluid intelligence does slow down as we age.
Okay.
But then you have crystallized intelligence. This is the accumulated knowledge, the vocabulary, the specialized skills and strategies you've gathered over an entire lifetime.
Oh, so if fluid intelligence is a computer's RAM, crystallized intelligence is the massive hard drive.
Exactly. The RAM might get a bit slower, but the hard drive is packed with incredibly valuable heuristics. Because of this, crystallized intelligence holds steady and actually continues to improve well into middle age and beyond.
So we get smarter in a different way.
Older adults can often solve complex problems faster than younger people because they rely on decades of pattern recognition rather than raw, brute force processing speed.
Now, the textbook does address the extreme end of cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's disease.
It does. It notes that early foundational research into Alzheimer's was pioneered by a medical researcher named Solomon Carter Fuller.
Okay.
Alzheimer's involves physical plaques and tangles forming in the brain, causing severe memory loss and cognitive disruption. But the text emphasizes that this isn't just an unavoidable fate for everyone.
There are preventative measures.
Keeping mentally and physically active alongside a healthy diet can significantly mitigate the risks of cognitive decline.
That is really reassuring, but physical and cognitive health is only part of it. What about our social networks? Because the stereotype is that getting older physically means getting isolated and lonely socially.
You would think so, but the data tells a very different story. The textbook highlights socio-emotional selectivity theory.
What does that say?
As we age, our overall number of friends does naturally dwindle. But the theory shows that the friendships and relationships we do keep become much closer and far more emotionally fulfilling than the wide, shallow networks we maintained in our younger years.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, quality heavily overtakes quantity as we realize our time is finite.
Well, looking at my notes, I think we have mapped the entire voyage.
I think we have. I'm ready to officially take off the lecturer hat.
And I will happily drop the student persona.
Yeah.
But stepping back and looking at all of these sources synthesized together, the sheer scale of this developmental journey is staggering.
It really is. You start as a fragile single-cell zygote, just fighting the brutal biological odds in the dark of the womb.
Right.
Then you're an infant running physics experiments on toy trucks to understand reality. Then a teenager navigating a wildly rewiring frontal lobe, just trying to find your identity. And finally an adult, maybe moving a little slower physically, but armed with this incredible, unshakable treasure trove of crystallized intelligence.
It's a relentless state of becoming. You are never actually finished.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over on your own. If our brains are constantly blooming, pruning, and actively assigning new meaning to our environments, from the literal moment of conception all the way through the late stages of aging,
Yeah.
at what specific age are you actually your truest, most authentic self?
Or is the self not a final destination at all, but simply the current temporary state of your neural pathways?
Exactly. Because as we said at the start, there is no dry dock. The ship is always sailing and it is always being built. Thanks for joining us on this Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.